All right, let's go ahead and get into part three, and this will be the final part of this chapter. We're going to hit a couple of these last topics as we go down the chain, but we're going to talk about the brain first. So most of this stuff is important. There's a few details that I'll say you don't need to remember, but for the most part, all this stuff will be fair game. Okay, we're just going to start off with the regions of the brain. So all this in tan is your cerebrum. And so that's the largest portion of the brain. It has these really thick ridges. They're known as gyri, an individual will be a gyrus. And then you have these grooves known as sulci, or a single groove is a sulcus. So this is where a majority of our nerves and kind of everything that controls our body resides. But there are also some specialized parts as well. The diencephalon, it's not actually the diencephalon is not a direct part of it. It's a region. So it's made up of the cerebrum and the midbrain. You also have your cerebellum. So that's another large region. It's smaller than the cerebrum, but it has a crazy amount of neurons. And so it has a lot to do with our vestibular function, our balance, our proprioceptive function, all that stuff. Finally, we have our brain stem, which can be broken down into three different parts. You have your midbrain, your pons, and your medulla oblongata, or a lot of times you'll just hear that referred to as the medulla. And we'll talk about each individual function of the brain stem a little bit further along. So this little picture here shows that you have a right and a left hemisphere. It's divided directly down the middle by the longitudinal fissure. So if a sulcus is deep enough or really, really large, then it's referred to as a fissure. So the longitudinal fissure divides both halves of the brain, and it has a ton of nerves, kind of a super thick layer of nerves that connect to the two halves, which is known as your corpus callosum. And so that's how both halves communicate with each other, is through the corpus callosum. Okay, getting into the bones of the skull. So obviously your brain is super important, so it needs a lot of protection. So you have the actual bone, which provides the most protection, of course. And then, like we talked about before, we get into the meninges. So we have bone, and then our outer layer is the dura mater. We have our meningeal layer. And so that's kind of another part of the dura mater. We have our arachnoid mater, which is the middle layer. And we have our pia mater, which is actually connected to the brain and contains some of the blood vessels. So within the dura mater, there's some spaces at times. And so these are known as sinuses. And this is so blood can pass and kind of space for vessels and all that stuff to run back to the heart. We have our subdural space. Remember, that's the space between the dura and the arachnoid mater. And then we have the subarachnoid space, which is our space between the arachnoid mater and the pia mater. And then the last part of this little diagram is that the dura mater can extend inward, and that's how certain parts of the brain are separated by the meninges. So one example of this is the falx cerebri. You don't have to memorize that, but it kind of dips into the longitudinal fissure, and that separates the halves there. So the dura mater is what kind of causes that separation. Okay, moving on to the ventricles. So the primary role of the ventricles is to produce and move cerebral spinal fluid throughout the brain. So there's four different chambers. You have your lateral ventricles, so there's a right and a left. You have what's known as your third ventricle, and then you have what's known as your fourth ventricle, which ends up narrowing and forming the central canal, which goes directly through your spinal cord, carrying cerebrospinal fluid. So it's formed in the choroid plexus. That's where CSF originates, but you don't necessarily need to memorize this full chart here. I do want you to know that the first step is that the choroid plexus and the lateral ventricle secrete the cerebrospinal fluid. So you do need to know that. And so I don't need you to memorize some of these next steps. So it goes from those lateral ventricles into the third ventricle. And the third ventricle also has a choroid plexus, which produces even more CSF. It then goes into the fourth ventricle. And remember that fourth ventricle narrows to form the central canal of the spinal cord. It also has a choroid plexus to produce more fluid. So we have some that goes into that central canal, but a lot of it will end up into our subarachnoid space. Remember, that's between pia mater and arachnoid mater. And so basically it'll flow through that space to kind of completely cover the brain and supply the spinal cord with as much as it needs. So I want you to know the other end of the pathway here is that the cerebrospinal fluid is then absorbed into the veins or the venous bloodstream from the arachnoid mater into the sinuses, and this is known as the arachnoid villi. That's what pulls the CSF back into the bloodstream. This is just a little animation that takes you through that, but like I said, I want you to know, number one, that the choroid plexus in the lateral ventricles is what kind of starts the pathway. And I want you to know that the arachnoid villi reabsorb some of that CSF into the venous system. Okay, question 5. Which statement about gray matter is true? So before I even ask you this, well, let's do this and then we'll circle back. Okay, so A, it covers the exterior of the brain. B, it forms the interior of the brain. C, it consists of myelinated fibers. Or D, it secretes cerebrospinal fluid. And I'll give you the hint, if you remember the spinal cord, it's opposite of that. So A, it's going to cover the outer portion of the brain. So gray matter, or a lot of the cell bodies, the unmyelinated stuff, is going to cover the surface of the brain. The interior is going to be our white matter. So if you go back up this way, where's the picture of it? Oh, here we go. That's the one I'm talking about. So in our brain, you see the outside is the darker color. That's our gray matter. And all the axons and myelinated nerves are on the interior. And so we know the gray matter does not consist of myelinated fibers, and it's our choroid plexus that secretes our CSF. Okay, zooming in on the brainstem, we're going to talk about kind of each individual function of the 3 different parts. So our midbrain, it has tracks to relay sensory and motor information. There's also some audio and visual reflexes as well. And some muscle control. So the midbrain does a little bit of everything. The pons has some tracks that actually will turn into some cranial nerves, which we'll talk about a little bit farther along. And again, just kind of convey signals to different aspects of the brain. So you need to know that the midbrain and the pons are part of the brainstem, but you don't need to know anything more specific than that. Now, the medulla oblongata, or just the medulla, on the other hand, you do need to know that it has kind of our essential life functions are what's under control by the medulla. So it has our cardiac center, which regulates our heart rate, our vasomotor center, that controls kind of our blood vessel dilation, so blood pressure in a sense, and also the respiratory center, which of course controls breathing. This also has a few cranial nerves that begin in the medulla. But basically, if we don't have our medulla function, we cannot stay alive. So a lot of times if we have brain injuries or swelling of the brain, when the medulla swells, or if swelling puts too much pressure on the medulla in the foramen magnum, that's oftentimes what can lead to death. Okay, our cerebellum, remember, this is the second largest part of the brain, but it has the most nerves. So it sits on this back part of the brain. Sometimes you'll hear this referred to as kind of the mini brain, because it looks very similar to the brain in terms of the gyruses, or the gyri and the sulci. And so its main thing is that it monitors our body movements and it communicates with our cerebral cortex to maintain balance, coordination, and posture. So this is also what helps our muscle groups work really well together. As a physical therapist, every once in a while, you'll see someone that had a stroke or had a brain injury, hit to the back of the head, concussion, where their cerebellum isn't functioning quite right, and they kind of walk like they're drunk. It's hard for them to really move smoothly and keep their balance. So it really is what helps us move as smoothly and efficiently as we do. So to do that, it has to take in input from kind of our feet on the ground, like our actual touch sensation, kind of our perception of space, our proprioception, or our sense of where our joints are in space. It uses sound as well. Like I said, people with cerebellar dysfunction have really rough gait, which is another term for walking. They look really funky, poor balance. They can't move smoothly. Sometimes you'll see a tremor. Um, and because there's a lack of connection between the cerebral cortex and the cerebellum, they can also tend to have poor impulse control and overreact emotions wise because everything's not kind of in sync. Okay, remember the diencephalon is not a structure itself, but rather a region. And the two most important things in the diencephalon are your thalamus and your hypothalamus. So the thalamus is a major structure in our sensory system. So it's kind of a gateway for all of our sensory impulses. So that includes obviously smell, sight, taste, pain is included in this. Just pressure sensations, hot and cold, as well as just light touch, vibration, all that kind of stuff. So before it travels all the way to the cerebral cortex, it kind of hits the thalamus first. And so even though we don't kind of think about it, we have an incredible amount of information coming to our brain at one time. So if we paid attention to every single little stimulus that we got, we would go nuts. So the job of the thalamus is to kind of weed out the unimportant signals and let the signals that are important that we need to pay attention to get all the way through. So it also has a role in just kind of managing complex movements or making sure those go well. And then some memory and emotion is also involved because our senses really play a role in those two things. We also have the hypothalamus in this area. So this is a little bit smaller, but it's also very crucial in our sensory system. And it extends to every single organ in the body. So we'll get into the autonomic nervous system a little bit farther. So that's our visceral nervous system, what goes to our organs. And the hypothalamus has a very large role in what happens in that system. So, like I said, it's a huge role in the autonomic nervous system, which controls our organs, such as does heart rate, blood pressure, a lot of other things. And it also controls the pituitary gland, which is known as the master gland because it has such a large influence over our endocrine system. So we'll talk about the pituitary gland a lot more in the endocrine system. And then again, it's involved in emotion. Okay, this one is kind of more of a nice to know slide rather than a need to know slide. So if you look on page 202 in your book, it's a body at work example regarding the reticular formation. So if you want to take a look at that to see this a little bit more in depth, you're welcome to, but you're not really going to be tested on this stuff. Okay, question 6. The cardiac and respiratory centers are found in the A, pons, B, cerebellum, C, diencephalon, or D, medulla. So try to remember back to our brainstem slide. And the answer is D, medulla. And so remember, our pons is conveying signals. That midbrain also has tracks to convey signals. Our cerebellum is more of our balance, proprioception, body movement system. And then remember, the diencephalon is not a structure within itself. but it houses the thalamus and hypothalamus, which are more involved in our sensory system. Okay, so the cerebrum itself is separated into different regions. And so each of these regions, based on kind of what's contained there, has a different role in kind of how it affects us. So our frontal lobe in the front of the brain, that's where a lot of our nerves are contained for voluntary movements. Our memory center, it has a role in emotion and social judgment. A lot of times when people have a frontal lobe injury, their personalities change. They become very impulsive and aggressive. So our temporal lobe, this is on the outside, kind of right above the ears in a sense. So this contains our centers for hearing, our auditory center, for smell, for learning, memory, emotional behavior, and visual recognition. And then on the left side of our brain, our temporal lobe also contains some of our language centers. The parietal lobe is on kind of the upper part of the brain. And so that is receiving and interpreting body sensations, a lot of our sensory system in the parietal lobe. And then the occipital lobe is primarily involved in our visual information. So a hit to the back of the head can really mess with the visual system. Deeper in the brain, there's a region called the insula. It sits behind the lateral sulcus. And so it has some roles in perception of pain, our basic emotions, and it also is where kind of our the addictions or addictive centers are regulated, our motor control, some self-awareness, and also cognitive functioning. So you do kind of need to know the some of the specific or the unique roles that each lobe plays. Okay, taking a look inside the cerebrum, we already talked about how it's reversed to the spinal cord. So we have our gray matter on the outside and our white matter on the inside. Remember, our longitudinal fissure is connected with the corpus callosum that allows the right and left halves to communicate. The cerebral cortex is another word for the gray matter. So remember, our cerebrum is this whole thing, but the cerebral cortex is this outer gray matter layer. It's about 40% of the brain's mass. The basal nuclei, they help with control of movement. And so they sit right here, kind of close to the corpus callosum on either side of the brain. And then remember our spinal tracts we talked about in the spinal cord section. So we have ascending tracts that carry sensory information, and we have descending tracts that carry our motor information. So next part of the brain we're going to talk about is the limbic system. And so this is made up of your hippocampus and amygdala. And so we consider this the emotional brain. So this is where a lot of our emotions are regulated. Sorry, guys, I had to kick the dog out real quick. So our hippocampus is involved in converting short-term memories into long-term memories. And so a lot of long-term memories, part of the reason we're able to remember them so well is because there's an emotional connection to the memory. So our hippocampus plays a role in processing that emotion and memory connection. And then our amygdala plays a similar role, and kind of it remembers our former emotions. So it kind of stores all of our emotional experiences and it can bring those back up when needed. Okay, we're going to talk about the sensory functions. So remember, this is contained primarily in our parietal lobe. So we have our postcentral gyrus. That's our primary somatic sensory area. The postcentral gyrus is the primary somatic sensory area. So it gets a lot of our impulses of hot and cold, light touch, kind of from everywhere. It gets all the info goes to the postcentral gyrus. We also have our somatic sensory association area. So we get kind of a large influx of info into the postcentral gyrus, and then that association area helps pinpoint and kind of filter through that information to know kind of where the pain is at, what are we feeling, and kind of how the body is positioned to react to it. Moving forward, you're looking at the motor side of things. So that's contained in the frontal lobe primarily. So you have your central sulcus, that's your primary area again. And so they primarily determine what movements we need to perform. So we get the information from our association area in terms of what we need to do. That will then go to the precentral gyrus, which will then send signals down our descending tracks to react. So initially we get info from our association area. That kind of determines what needs to happen. Once we know what needs to happen, we get our signal from the precentral gyrus down to the body's muscles. Okay, this is another one that you do not need to memorize. I really just want you to know that language has a sequence of events in multiple different parts of the brain that are involved. So see, number one's in the occipital lobe. So that's if we have a written word. There's then kind of a transfer from written to our thought about the spoken word. We then actually form that word. And so that's known as Wernicke's area. And so that helps us actually turn kind of words into sentences. The Wernicke's area then passes to Broca's area. That's where we actually plan our mouth and muscle movements to form that word or phrase that we just decided we can say. And then once we kind of make that plan in Broca's area, it goes to the precentral gyrus, which then tells the muscles how to talk or what shapes to make the words and phrases that we want. Like I said, you don't need to memorize all this. I more wanted you to just kind of be familiar. Wernicke's area and Broca's area are two things that you'll hear going forward. If you talk any more about the brain in language, especially. So Wernicke's area is where we kind of formulate our words and sentences. Broca's area is where we actually plan our muscle and mouth movements to make that happen. Okay, review question 7 for this chapter. The limbic system is charged with A, emotion and learning, B, identifying the location of pain, C, planning muscle movements to form words, or D, determining muscle movements to perform a task. So remember, A, our limbic system is the emotional brain. So our somatic association area is what helps us pinpoint pain. We just said Broca's area is where we plan our muscle movement to form words. And then the motor association area determines the movements required to perform a task before it passes it to the precentral or the primary motor cortex. Okay, cranial nerves. This is another section that we're going to go relatively quickly through because I do not need you guys to memorize every single cranial nerve. You should know that there is 12 of them. There's a little mnemonic in your book, and that's on page 211. That is a way to memorize these. Going forward, it is good to memorize these if you're going to be using this in a clinical setting at all. Oftentimes, when a patient first comes in, whether it's a car accident, a concussion, anything neuro-related, you're going to do a cranial nerve screen to try to rule out any involvement of the brain structures. Okay, so I'm going to talk through each one real quick, but you do not need to memorize these. Like I said, right now you should know that there is 12 of them, and that they are all stemming from the brain. Okay, so your first cranial nerve is your olfactory nerve. Okay, before I go all the way through, you should also know that there are some that are sensory, some that are motor, and some that are mixed. You don't have to memorize which ones are which, but you should know there's some cranial nerves that are only sensory, some cranial nerves that are only motor, some cranial nerves that do both. Okay, so cranial nerve 1's your olfactory nerve, so that's your sense of smell. So to test that, you test, a lot of times they use coffee or orange or very familiar strong scents. Cranial nerve 2 is your optic nerve. That's your visual nerve. So your oculomotor nerve, your trochlear nerve, and your abducens nerve, all of these move the eyes. They're all motor nerves that move the eyes. Cranial nerve number 5, that's your trigeminal nerve. It does kind of a lot. It has some sensory branches in the face. So there's a few different divisions of where if you're lacking sensation, it can be on your face that it could be the trigeminal nerve damage. It does blinking. And it can also detect touch on your eyeball. So we already did 6 with the eye movements. 7, you have your facial nerve. So this is innervates a lot of the muscles that your face can move. So your facial expressions are controlled by your facial nerve, or the muscles that create your facial expressions are controlled by the facial nerve. And there's also sensation. This is a mixed nerve, so you get taste as part of this. Okay, number 8, you have your vestibular cochlear nerve. So this is related to hearing and balance. Damage can result in dizziness, balance issues, hearing issues. Where are we at? Let's see. Don't go too out of here. Here we go. Okay, we'll pop across to 9. Your glossopharyngeal nerve. So that moves your tongue. It does some swallowing. It's also part of your gag reflex is controlled by that nerve. It can also feel some touch of the tongue as well as hot and cold sensation on the tongue. Number 10 is your vagus nerve. So it's a very big cranial nerve compared to the others in terms of how far it spreads, because it goes all the way to your lungs, goes to your heart, goes to your digestive system, it goes to your urinary system. So an extremely important nerve. It also supplies some organs in your head as well. So a lot of times it can cause hoarseness or loss of voice with it damaged. Swallowing can be impaired. And so if you have damage to your vagus nerve, it can be a really, really big problem. And so the common test for that is to have someone say, basically. All right, your hypoglossal nerve is number 12. Oh, sorry, let's go to 11. So number 11 is your spinal accessory nerve. And so it controls some of the muscles that move your head and neck, and you can shrug up your shoulders with those muscles as well. So a lot of times we'll check if they can shrug. And then last but not least, your hypoglossal nerve, again, controls some tongue movements. And so obviously if your tongue doesn't move well, your speech and swallowing and eating are all going to be impaired. Okay, the autonomic nervous system, or our visceral nervous system. So this is going to regulate a lot of our organs, glands, stuff like that. So it helps maintain homeostasis. It sends impulses to cardiac and our other smooth muscle, like in our digestive system, to help control those systems. And like I said, it's also known as the visceral motor system or the visceral nervous system. Okay, so the way reflexes work in the autonomic nervous system. So think back to our negative feedback loops. So the negative and positive feedback loops are largely controlled by the autonomic nervous system. So what happens is the receptors, in this case, the heart or in an organ, detect a change. So our afferent neurons are going to transmit that info to our brain. Remember, afferent arrives. The brain's going to interpret that info and then send a signal via an efferent nerve. Remember, efferent exits, and then the organ is then going to respond based on whatever that signal is. And oftentimes they're going to get that signal from a nerve that is part of the autonomic nervous system. Okay, so we're going to talk about the difference between an autonomic and a somatic pathway. So somatic is kind of our voluntary muscle nerve system pathway. When you see somatic, you should think kind of skeletal muscle movement, voluntary. So in the somatic nervous system, the cell body is in the spinal cord typically. and then it's going to go through a spinal nerve. Myelinated axon is going to extend all the way to a muscle and muscle fibers. Remember, ACH gets released, muscle contracts. The autonomic pathway is a bit different. So this is the autonomic pathway. So in this case, we still kind of exit through that spinal nerve. We have a myelinated preganglionic neuron, which is going to extend either from the brainstem or the spinal cord. And then in the ganglion, it's going to, in the ganglion, it's going to reach a postganglionic neuron. And so we have these cell bodies near the organ. So in our somatic system, the cell bodies are far from its end goal. It sits in the spinal cord, really long neuron to get to the muscle. In this case, it's a really long nerve to get to the actual cell body, which is going to be close to the heart. So once that preganglionic myelinated neuron reaches the postganglionic neuron, the postganglionic neuron is going to get that ACH signal, and they're going to release whatever signal they need to the heart. So this is based on whether it's a parasympathetic fiber or a sympathetic fiber that is stimulated. And we're going to talk about parasympathetic versus sympathetic here shortly. But basically, there's acetylcholine released if we're going to have a parasympathetic response, and there's epinephrine or norepinephrine released when we have a sympathetic response. Okay, so our sympathetic nervous system, that's kind of our fight or flight system. So that prepares the body for activity. Our parasympathetic is when we're kind of shutting things down. It's going to calm our body function. So those are our two different divisions of the autonomic nervous system. Okay, so as we said, our sympathetic division. So this is also known as the thoracolumbar division because all the neurons for the sympathetic division arise from the thoracic and lumbar region. One non-nerve structure that plays a large role in the sympathetic nervous system is our adrenal glands. And so these actually sit on top of our kidneys. And so when they're stimulated, they secrete epinephrine and norepinephrine into our bloodstream. And so our sympathetic receptors will respond to the release of epinephrine and norepinephrine. Then we have our parasympathetic division. This is known as our craniosacral division because we have some that start all the way in the brain and kind of super high up. And then we have our sacral division of parasympathetic nerves as well. Okay, so we're going to go into these a little bit more in depth. So this chart, I would definitely like you to memorize. So this works really, really well to distinguish the sympathetic and parasympathetic division. So we just said sympathetic originates in the thoracolumbar region, whereas parasympathetic originates in the craniosacral region. So remember, our sympathetic nerves are going to sit right, kind of cell bodies are going to lie right with the spinal cord. In the parasympathetic division, we have that ganglion near the target organ that contains our postganglionic neuron. So in the sympathetic division, we have a very short preganglionic fiber with a very long postganglionic fiber going to its target, whereas vice versa in the parasympathetic division, we have that long myelinated preganglionic fiber, and then the postganglionic fiber is short because it's really close to the organ that it influences. The norepinephrine or epinephrine is our two different neurotransmitters for the sympathetic division. Occasionally, it can be acetylcholine, but don't worry about that. Anytime you see norepinephrine, think sympathetic. Anytime you see acetylcholine, think parasympathetic. So sympathetic can produce widespread and more general effects. It kind of affects our whole body, whereas parasympathetic is really close to the organ that it's going to affect, so it's going to be more local effect. Okay, which of the following is an action of the parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system? So A, increase heart rate, B, constrict bronchial tubes, C, stimulate sweat glands, or D, inhibit intestinal motility. This is probably a little bit tough because I didn't go super in depth into each individual function. So this is not an easy question. The answer would be B, which is constrict the bronchial tubes. So the sympathetic division does the increase in heart rate. It'll stimulate your sweat glands and it will inhibit intestinal motility. So I want you guys to take a look at page 214 in your book. And so it has a list of all of the different things that the sympathetic and parasympathetic division do. In general, your sympathetic division is your excitatory system. So it's going to increase alertness, increase heart rate. It'll dilate your bronchioles and blood vessels so that you can have an increase in airflow and blood flow. Your parasympathetic division is going to calm things down. So it's going to decrease heart rate. It's going to constrict bronchioles and blood vessels and bronchioles. It's going to shut down. And it has a couple of functions, and it kind of stimulates your intestinal system as well in terms of parasympathetic. But take a look at that table on page 214 to see the differences in the two divisions in terms of their role in the body. Okay, talking about neurotransmitters, we can put these into a couple different categories. So we have cholinergic fibers. And so these can be in sympathetic and the parasympathetic division. But the postganglionic fibers are always going to be parasympathetic, and they secrete acetylcholine. So cholinergic, acetylcholine kind of go together. They have adrenergic fibers, and this you can associate with the sympathetic division, and that's going to secrete norepinephrine. So in general, cholinergic fibers you can associate with parasympathetic, adrenergic you can think sympathetic. So breaking it a little bit further down, our cholinergic receptors have two different types. You have nicotinic and muscarinic. So nicotinic are in the adrenal medulla. They're also at the neuromuscular junction, and they produce an excitatory response. So these are receptors for acetylcholine. So if acetylcholine binds to a nicotinic receptor, an excitatory response is going to follow. In muscarinic, it's going to be not necessarily opposite, but can be variable. So these are in glands, smooth muscle like the digestive system, our cardiac muscles, basically any organ that is innervated by a cholinergic fiber. And so these ones actually produce a variable response. So some may be excitatory receptors, while others may be inhibitory receptors. So the reason we have these muscarinic receptors is so that acetylcholine is able to stimulate or cause an excitatory response in certain organs while getting an inhibitory response in other organs. So that this can allow for opposite effects to happen at once. Okay, our adrenergic receptors, and so we basically have two different types. Alpha are excited by norepinephrine, while beta are inhibited by norepinephrine. So an alpha adrenergic receptor are excitatory, beta adrenergic are inhibited. They're both affected by norepinephrine. Okay, so just to walk you through here, so we have a cholinergic fiber, meaning it's going to secrete acetylcholine. It's going to bind to a nicotinic receptor. So most of our postganglionic neurons are adrenergic, meaning they're going to secrete norepinephrine. And then sometimes we'll have a postganglionic neuron that's cholinergic in the sympathetic division, which would secrete ACH. So just to be clear, we're talking about the sympathetic division right now. And you don't have to worry about this too much. This is just an illustration of what we just talked about with the receptors. So preganglionic neurons are going to secrete acetylcholine. That's going to bind to the nicotinic receptors on the postganglionic neuron. If that postganglionic neuron is an adrenergic fiber, it's going to go and secrete norepinephrine. Whether it's alpha or beta depends on the target and what they are trying to induce. Sometimes that postganglionic neuron can be a cholinergic fiber and secrete ACH, which will bond to our muscarinic receptors and have that variable response. Our parasympathetic is a little more straightforward. So you're still going to have a cholinergic fiber preganglionic. Still, that acetylcholine binds to the nicotinic on the postganglionic. And then the postganglionic is also going to be a cholinergic fiber, which secretes ACH, which is going to bind to a muscarinic receptor. So, like I said, don't get too caught up in memorizing this stuff. Just make sure you know the neurotransmitters and the receptors. Okay, the effect produced by a neurotransmitter is ultimately determined by A, the amount released, the type of receptor, or the number of receptors. And the answer is going to be C. So this one you really kind of had to think about a little bit. So the amount of the neurotransmitter may influence the strength of the response, but not the actual type of response. And so effects can vary based on type of neurotransmitter. The same neurotransmitter binding to a different receptor is going to have a different response. Therefore, the receptor itself truly is what determines your response. And again, the number of receptors influences the strength of the response. So the receptor itself is really the final determining factor in what the response will be. Okay, a couple quick things to finish up with. You don't have to, these last few slides are not memorizing slides. This one's just to know there's two different hemispheres of the brain, right and left, and each one has different functions. So they control opposite sides of the body, and then they each kind of have their own unique roles in our functions. Memory itself is a neuro pathway. That's how we store memories. And so, of course, it starts with an actual sensory input, whether that's touch, smell, vision, usually a lot of those combined. We then attach meaning to that. So that happens in like the hippocampus and amygdala. That's known as encoding, when we're attaching meaning to our memories. We then form a new neural pathway associated with that memory. And so the more we think about that memory or recall that memory, the stronger that pathway becomes. And then when we have a new experience, sometimes we can alter our old pathways, or again, we may form a new pathway. Okay, sleep. What I mainly want you to know about sleep is that it's very important to our nerve function, but I don't need you to memorize all these stages by any means. I'm trying to check my notes real quick to see if there's anything I definitely want you to know about the sleep slide. I would say, if anything, I really want you to know that there are different stages of sleep. This REM sleep is where our dreams occur. And then the only other thing that you need to know about sleep is that we spend the most time in this N2 stage, or our light sleep stage. So N2, light sleep, that's the largest amount of time we spend sleeping in that stage, but dreaming occurs in our REM sleep, which stands for rapid eye movement. Okay, and that's the end of chapter 11. I know that was a lot, guys. So take a look at your books. I think there's a lot of helpful visuals in there, as well as some tables and summarized points to look at, and take your time going through. Like I said, I tried to tell you what not to pay attention to, so don't get caught up in memorizing every little thing. All right, bye.